In this video, we will discuss global and international public relations. Globally, we see public relations most developed in industrialized nations like the United States, Canada, Europe, and parts of Asia. We also see that it emerges more readily in nations that have multi-party political systems, considerable private ownership of business and industry, large-scale urbanization, and relatively high per capita income levels, which also affect literacy and educational opportunities. To think about global public relations, we must first start with the concept of globalization. Globalization is a business term that looks at increasingly connected international relationships that in turn affect culture, people, and economic activity. When we think about globalization, particularly in presidential debates or in democratic politics, there's not really one consensus of whether it's a good or a bad thing. Quite honestly, it's just a thing that exists that affects people in the world around us. But some political agendas would say globalization can be a bad thing as it moves local job opportunities away from the local community and resources them out to or outsources them to global communities. But then on the other hand, when we look at those global communities or communities in other aspects of the world from ours, it provides work opportunities for them. So again, it's a thing that exists that positively and negatively affects those around us. What we've seen is that globalization contributes to economic growth in developed and developing countries as part of a larger transnational circulation of ideas, languages, and popular culture. What we see is an increased need for intercultural communication experts for governments, multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations or NGOs. So what that means for public relations is that as corporations and organizations move globally, they have an increasing need for people who can communicate across borders, across cultural identities, and across languages. From a global perspective, we know that multinational corporations must be sensitive to how their actions affect people of different cultures and geographies. They must consider things like language, cultural values, and geography, and try to avoid ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the idea that one's culture is better or superior to other or different cultures from their own. That's problematic when we bring that into business relations or public relations on a global scale in terms of having a superior attitude or complex. Instead, multinational corporations need to seriously consider the idea of equivalency, that different cultures can be just as good and just as valuable as our own, and not take on or embrace that idea that our way of life, our democratic thinking is somehow better than the other countries within which we're working. To put this in context or perspective, the 10 most powerful brands in the world are based in the US, but they operate globally. So again, we need to be thinking, how can our business and our operation run in a universal global perspective and not just be super entrenched in US American values? Multinational companies must also reinforce the notion that they are responsible, concerned citizens of the local and global community. So they need to think global and act local to win support. And in this sense, it means really putting our money where our mouths are and becoming involved in local, global communities, if that makes sense. So again, thinking about how when we are operating outside of the United States, how do our actions, our words, our promises, our ideologies, how do they work within the cultural context that is outside of the United States? So to put this further into context, in the 1970s, Hofstede conducted a global survey of cultural values around the world. And what was found during this survey was how the United States fared against other countries across 6 cultural dimensions. I'm going to skip around this slide a little bit and move from what the U.S. is most scored, or what the U.S. scored most highly in, to least highly. So looking at the graph in front of you, we see that the United States scored highest in individualism, and this is actually highest across the globe the U.S. scored. So what this means is the extent to which people feel independent as opposed to being interdependent as members of larger wholes. Individualism means that individual choices and decisions are expected, where collectivism means that one knows one place in life, which is determined socially. So as we all know, because most of us have been born and raised this way, and if we were born and raised in the United States cultural context, we're constantly told to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, to hold our own selves accountable for what we can achieve, and when we fail, it's our own fault and nobody else's, and things like that. The next highest cultural dimension is indulgence. In an indulgent culture, it is good to be free. Doing what your impulses want you to do is good, and friends are important and life makes sense. In a restrained culture, the feeling is that life is hard and duty, not freedom, is the normal state of being. In the United States, we score more highly and we're more towards an indulgent culture, meaning that impulse is encouraged amongst people to do what feels good and to do what we enjoy doing. The next highest cultural dimension is that of masculinity. This is the extent to which the use of force is endorsed socially. It indicates that the society will be driven by competition, achievement, and success, with success being defined by the winner or best in the field. This value system starts in childhood and continues throughout one's life, both in work and leisure pursuits. This is not about individuals, but about expected emotional gender roles. In masculine societies, these are much more openly gendered than feminine societies, and we see that a lot in the United States, where we have very rigid gender roles and expectations of how we should perform our gender. The next cultural dimension is uncertainty avoidance. And for this, the United States scored 46, which actually puts us pretty much near the center, which means that the US is a little bit avoidant, yet not avoidant of uncertainty. So what this dimension deals with is a society's tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, anxiety and distrust in the face of the unknown, and conversely, with a wish to have fixed habits and rituals and to know the truth. So in the US, we are accepting of new ideas, innovative products, and a willingness to try something new or different. But when we're placed in a fearful situation, we become reliant on structures and rituals to help us understand the unknown. The fifth cultural dimension I'll discuss is power distance. So this is the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations and institutions accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. It has to do with the fact that a society's inequality is endorsed by the followers as much as by the leaders. And we see this in the United States. We know that there's a certain amount of inequality pervasive throughout our society, but for many of us, we don't do anything to stop that or confront that. We just accept it as is. The last cultural dimension I'll discuss is long-term orientation, for which the United States scored a 26, which is pretty low. So this category deals with how every society has to maintain some links with its own past while dealing with the challenges of the present and the future. So in this sense, the US is very short-term oriented. The US prefers to maintain time-honored traditions and norms while viewing societal change with suspicion. In a short-term oriented culture, the world is essentially as it was created, so that the past provides a moral compass, and adhering to it is morally good. As you can imagine, this dimension predicts life philosophies, religiosity, and educational achievement. Another context for this would be American businesses who measure their performance on a short-term basis, with profit and loss statements being issued on a quarterly basis. This also drives individuals to strive for quick results within the workplace. In this slide, we'll talk about how brands could be managed across borders. So first and foremost, we need to understand where our communities are. We can do this through Google Analytics and social media audits to really do some, again, background research of our target audience to understand geographically where they're based out of, as well as culturally where their perspectives might be coming from. The second step here is to then organize our channels. We need to pick one focal point, owned media versus third-party or earned media, as a primary source of communication, but again, not ignoring those other media platforms and looking with an eye towards how are we going to converge these platforms and maintain a consistent messaging across various platforms. We need to also use third-party platforms to listen and respond to communities in their own language if we ourselves are not proficient. Lastly, we can't forget about search engine optimization. So we need to develop content that meets our audience needs based off of their search engine history. We need to implement global social media policies. So this is going to become even more complex, right? It's not just thinking about social media within one cultural context or one country's context, but now thinking about how do these work across global contexts, across different languages, across different user usages of various platforms. And lastly, then, we need to measure, iterate, and refine. So we need to be sure to establish outcomes that reflect our business goals, then key performance indicators to show progress towards those outcomes. In this slide, I'll talk about the rules of global brand content creation. So with the global audience, we need to avoid irrelevant and inappropriate content. So we need to be culturally sensitive and think about the cultures within which we're working. We cannot rely too much on Google Translate. While it is a useful and helpful tool, it might be a starting point, but we need to always try and work with proficient individuals for that and with that language. Whenever possible, we need to try and use images to avoid any sort of language barriers. But again, being mindful of cultural translations of those images. We need to also keep in mind that relevance is critical. We need to be informed about hot topics and sensitive issues and try to avoid sensitive issues and not inflaming issues because we didn't do our research. Next, we need to identify the right influencers in each target market, keeping in mind that not all markets are created equal and certain influencers will work well in some markets but may not work as well in other markets. And lastly, in general, in public relations, we need to not blast our targets with the same corporate material. Again, being mindful of engaging and relevant and topical and newsworthy information that encourage people to engage with us and not just become a dumping ground for information. Lastly, in this video, I'm going to talk about non-corporate global public relations within two different areas, public diplomacy as well as non-governmental organizations or NGOs. So for public diplomacy, this is where we're trying to promote the understanding of U.S. culture and U.S. foreign policy objectives. We're typically going to see this within the political realm and political communication about how we can use international relations as a tool for foreign diplomacy. Secondly, with NGOs, non-corporate global public relation works as a social service, working with activist organizations, and it's seen as credible by public and the media due to a lack of self-interest. So when working with NGOs, it's similar to working with nonprofits. The idea is really, or the onus is really on community relations and working with publics in a sort of non-selfish way. Again, trying to serve a greater common good.